and then a return to much more average temperatures from the weekend onwards.
Tonight at 10, a special report from the front line as Russian forces tighten their grip on eastern Ukraine. As desperate civilians try to flee the city of Lysychansk, we have evidence of the ruthless tactics used by Russia.
This is a deliberate tactic: bomb, shell, burn, and leave nothing but scorched earth.
And in neighbouring Severodonetsk, the Russians have virtually cut off the city from the rest of Ukraine. We'll have compelling new accounts of the progress being made by President Putin's forces. Also tonight, despite loud protests, the Court of Appeal gives the go-ahead for the first flight taking asylum seekers to Rwanda. Taking goods from Britain to Northern Ireland. How the UK government proposes to scrap parts of the Brexit deal it signed.
From Rwanda to Brexit, the government taking on the courts at home and facing accusations abroad of breaking international law.
And a world first in the field of biology, mapping the genome sequence of every species in the British Isles.
And coming up in the sport on the BBC News Channel, tantalisingly poised, England set up a grandstand finish against New Zealand as James Anderson breaks yet another record.
Very warm welcome to BBC News at 10, and we start tonight with a special report from eastern Ukraine, where Russian forces are tightening their grip on the country's industrial heartland, the region of the Donbass. President Zelensky has called again for Western allies to provide advanced missile defence systems for the Ukrainian army to stop the steady Russian advance. The Russians now control almost all of the strategic city of Severodonetsk after lots of fighting, and tonight the final bridge to that city has been destroyed, trapping Ukrainian troops and thousands of civilians. The Ukrainian government, by the way, says that Russia is able to keep up all of this military activity for one reason: because it is still earning huge amounts by selling oil and gas despite the global economic sanctions. Well, the Russians are also bombarding the neighbouring city of Lysychansk, where civilians are desperately trying to flee. Our international correspondent Ola Girin with video journalist Colm O'Malloy have sent this report from the Donbass. Let's turn then to the day's other main story, which is that earlier this evening, Boris Johnson published his highly controversial plans to give ministers the power to get rid of parts of the Brexit deal that he signed with the EU. The Prime Minister basically wants to change what's called the Northern Ireland Protocol to make it easier for some goods to move between Britain and Northern Ireland. Now, the EU says that these planned changes are simply not acceptable and that they break international law. So let's look at the plans and explain a little about what's behind them. What we need to focus on, of course, is the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which, just let's repeat and underline, is in the European Union. Hence the need for checks on goods. Now, basically, the frontier needs to be kept trouble-free, tension-free. It's really an area that's been full of trouble in the past, and really part of the peace process was to keep it in a place where friction was reduced to a minimum. No checks there. Well, if there are no checks there, where do they take place? Well, basically, between the British Isles and between Northern Ireland, between Britain and Northern Ireland itself. That's the rub here. Now, that was the deal agreed by Boris Johnson. It's a deal he now doesn't want and wants to change, because the Unionists in Northern Ireland also detest the deal. They see it as dividing the UK. So what's on the table now? A green lane. That's what Boris Johnson's come up with in his government. A green lane for goods that are destined only for Northern Ireland. They're not going to the EU. They wouldn't need any checks. And then a separate lane, a red lane, for those goods which are going through Northern Ireland but destined for the European Union. There'd be checks on those goods. So does this alternative plan stand a chance of passing muster with the EU? It doesn't look as if that's the case. We'll talk about that in a second. First, this report from our political editor, Chris Mason. Chris, many thanks. Chris Mason there with the latest analysis at Westminster. And Chris, they're of course mentioning that really now we're all looking at the response from the EU to see what they have to say. So let's join Katya Adler, our Europe editor in Brussels. No secret, Katya, that basically the EU is not keen on these changes, but what action is open to them? Katya, many thanks again for the latest thoughts there in Brussels. Katya Adler, our Europe editor. Quick reminder for you, you can find plenty of updates, more news, more analysis from Katya, Chris Mason and colleagues on BBC News Online. That's bbc.co.uk/news. And of course, you can use the BBC News app on your mobile device. Judges at the Court of Appeal have ruled that the first flight to Rwanda taking migrants who've arrived illegally in Britain can take off tomorrow. The judges supported a previous decision by the High Court that it was in the public interest for the government to carry out its policies. It's reported that there will be 8 asylum seekers on that first flight. Our home editor Mark Easton has the story. Holly Dance there, who's Archie Battersby's mother. Now, the UK economy shrank in April for the second month in a row. All the main sectors of the economy, services, manufacturing and production, were affected. And some economists say the UK now risks falling into recession. The government says it's focused on boosting growth. So there's plenty to talk about with our economics editor, Faisal Islam, who's joined me now in the studio. And when people look at these very disappointing growth figures, Faisal, and ask you for maybe a list of causes, what do you say to them?
Well, the first thing, this is actual data for April. As you say, you'll see that the figure is down 0.3% in that month. That was the same month, of course, when energy bills spiked so much by those record amounts, and we also got tax rises. The government's pointing to what actually pushed that negative, though, was the reduction in COVID NHS spending. But even if you take that into account, it's looking quite flat. But we tend to look at data over a run of months, not just in a single month, and you'll see the last time it grew was in January, and then it's been no growth since then. And indeed, if you take the National Institute's forecast for May and June, that continues. So basically, pretty likely that the economy is shrinking in this quarter, though not as bad as a recession just yet. We should be able to avoid that.
I suppose people will look at that and say, well, are other countries, comparable countries, facing the same kind of pressures? You know, how do we compare?
Well, they are facing the same pressures, but if you look into next year, then most of the forecasts are saying that UK is going to suffer little or, in fact, no growth. This is the OECD's forecast. UK bottom of that league. US and France, just we've taken 2 examples there, growing 1.2, 1.4%. Still actually not exactly roaring ahead, but better than zero.
And looking ahead to the rest of this week, we're just on Monday, and thinking, well, what other announcements could come this week that might change our perceptions.
So we've got the jobs data tomorrow. That's been a rare bright spot in the data. But inflation is obviously the key thing on people's minds right now. 9%, 4-decade high, heading up to 10%. And the Bank of England will make a further interest rate decision on Thursday, looking likely to be a further rise. So you have this really high inflation. You also have that stagnation I was talking about. Stagnation and inflation is this term stagflation. And that makes it's quite difficult to go and rein in inflation at the same time as avoiding a recession. It requires a double act between the Bank of England and the government, but that does seem where we are right now.
Faisal, we'll talk again as the week goes on. Thank you very much. Faisal Islam, there, our economics editor. Let's look briefly then at some of the other stories making the news today. The actor Kevin Spacey will appear in court in London on Thursday after being charged with sexual offences against 3 men. He's accused of 4 counts of sexual assault and 1 count of causing a person to engage in sexual activity without consent. Kevin Spacey has previously said he intends to prove his innocence. At the High Court, the businessman and prominent Brexit supporter Aaron Banks has lost his libel case against the investigative journalist Carol Cadwallader. Mr Banks, a major donor to the Leave.eu campaign, sued Ms Cadwallader over allegations that she'd made about Mr Banks and Russia. Ms Cadwallader said the case should be of concern to anyone who values freedom of speech. Mr Banks said he was likely to appeal against the judgment. A father left paralysed in the Manchester Arena bombing has conquered the summit of Africa's highest mountain in a wheelchair. Martin Hibbert launched the mission to scale Mount Kilimanjaro as he wanted to move mountains, he said, for disabled people. He's already raised around half of the £1 million target for the Spinal Injuries Association. By the way, you'll be able to see Martin and hear his incredible story on the breakfast sofa tomorrow morning. Well, tomorrow marks the 5th anniversary of the deadly fire at Grenfell Tower in West London, in which 72 people lost their lives. And the problem of flammable cladding on blocks of flats is still an acute one. Around 1 million people could still be living in blocks of flats with dangerous cladding, despite the government and property developers pledging some £9 billion to put things right. Our correspondent Judith Moritz has more details. Now, in what is probably the most ambitious project ever undertaken in the field of biology, a team of scientists is planning to sequence the genomes of all forms of life in the British Isles, estimated to be some 70,000 species. And the project can transform how we understand the natural world, and there may well be benefits for humans in search of medicines and materials inspired by nature. Our science editor, Rebecca Morell, has been finding out more. The time is 10:30, time for a look at the weather. And on a Monday, Matt, maybe a look ahead to the week that's coming up. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here. It's worth having a look actually, Hugh, because so far this summer it's been a rather cool start as it is, but things are about to change. Our first quick hit of summer heat is on its way. It's there at the moment across parts of Spain and Portugal. Will build into southern France over the next few days. Temperatures widely above 40 degrees. Heat and humidity, it all goes by the time we hit the weekend. So if you don't like heat and humidity, it's only a short burst. Hugh.
Good advice, Matt. Thank you very much. Thanks to Matt once again. And well, dear friends, that's BBC News at 10 from our new home here on Monday, the 13th of June. Don't forget, there's more analysis of the day's main stories on Newsnight. And there's Kirsty just going on air as we speak on BBC Two. Here on BBC One, well, there we are. All our colleagues in the nations and regions, all of them standing by right now with the news where you are. So stay with us. But from the 10 team, thank you for watching and good night.
Hello and welcome to our look ahead to what the papers will be bringing us tomorrow. With me are Sonia Soda, the chief leader writer at The Observer, and Olivia Utley, the assistant comment editor for the Daily Telegraph.